talking about justice, but every time the bill comes due, it's working families who pay, while the slogans walk away clean, John Kennedy said. And the sentence didn't just cut through the room, it rewired it. A murmur ran through the audience as a few people leaned forward, others stiffened, and someone whispered why he would go after her like that, right there, right then. The answer to that question, and why Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez froze for a fraction of a second she didn't expect the cameras to catch, only makes sense if you stay with this all the way through. Because this moment was never about a soundbite or a viral clip. It was about something far more uncomfortable for both sides. It was about who gets to define morality in American politics and who is forced to account for the consequences once the applause fades. I'm going to be direct about my own view from the outset, not because neutrality is impossible, but because pretending not to see patterns insults the intelligence of anyone who has watched Washington long enough. I believe this clash exposed a growing fracture in modern American politics, where moral certainty has become easier to perform than responsibility, and where accountability is often reframed as hostility when it comes from the wrong direction. That doesn't make John Kennedy a hero or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez a villain, but it does force us to examine why one style of politics survives scrutiny better than the other. If you've ever wondered why these exchanges feel less like debates and more like cultural collisions, this is where that feeling comes from. And if you're asking why the criticism sounds personal, stay until the end, because the reason isn't anger, it's arithmetic. The afternoon had started like dozens of hearings before it, slow, procedural, and largely ignored by anyone not paid to be there. Kennedy sat at the long table answering questions with the calm cadence of someone who had spent years inside budget spreadsheets rather than protest chants, occasionally adjusting his glasses as if time itself were on his side. Most senators had already drifted out. Staffers were half listening, and the C-SPAN cameras kept rolling with the indifference of machines that had seen too many moments people swore would change everything. This was not supposed to be a stage, and certainly not a battlefield. Then the doors opened, and the temperature of the room changed in a way no thermostat could explain. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did not enter quietly, and that was not an accident. Her arrival carried the energy of a rally compressed into a doorway, phones rising, supporters clapping, and a sense that something worth recording had just begun. She didn't take a seat or wait for recognition, choosing instead to stand, point, and speak as if the committee itself were an obstacle rather than a forum. When she accused Kennedy of hiding behind a folksy persona to shield billionaires while ordinary people suffered, the gallery reacted exactly as she expected. Applause erupted, hashtags were born, and a few bored reporters suddenly remembered why outrage pays the rent. Kennedy, by contrast, did not respond the way outrage politics trains its targets to respond. He didn't interrupt, didn't raise his voice, and didn't perform indignation for the cameras that were suddenly very interested in his face. Instead, he cleaned his glasses with deliberate slowness, a gesture that looked almost comical until you realized what it communicated. It said he was not rushed, not rattled, and not interested in competing for emotional dominance. In modern politics, that kind of patience is either a weakness or a warning, depending on what comes next. When he finally spoke, he didn't rebut her accusations directly, and that choice mattered more than most viewers realized in real time. He asked her, politely, whether she was finished, a question that landed like an insult precisely because it refused to mirror her intensity. This wasn't condescension for its own sake, it was a reset, a way of pulling the exchange out of performance mode and into something colder. The room felt it, even if the audience couldn't quite articulate why. Moments like this are where political theater either escalates into chaos or collapses under its own noise. Ocasio-Cortez took the question as provocation, which was understandable given how she had framed the encounter. To her supporters, this was a moral confrontation, a chance to expose what they see as cruelty disguised as moderation. Her language reflected that worldview, urgent, absolutist, and designed to leave no room for ambiguity or retreat. In that framing, hesitation looks like guilt, and nuance sounds like complicity. It is a powerful style, especially in an age where certainty travels faster than explanation. Kennedy's response strategy moved in the opposite direction, away from moral accusation and toward consequence. Rather than denying that inequality exists or pretending suffering is imaginary, he signaled that slogans do not balance budgets or employ families. This wasn't a denial of values, it was a challenge to outcomes. And that distinction is where the real conflict began, even if most viewers initially thought it was about tone. One side was arguing about what America should feel guilty about, the other about what America could realistically afford to fix. From my perspective, this is the fault line that defines so many modern political clashes, especially those that go viral. Moral clarity feels satisfying, but it does not automatically translate into functional policy. And that gap is where trust often dies. Ocasio-Cortez represents a generation that sees compromise as moral failure, because compromise looks like surrender to systems they believe are rigged. Kennedy represents a political culture that distrusts grand promises precisely because it has watched ambitious plans collapse under their own weight before. Neither instinct is inherently malicious, but they collide violently when neither side acknowledges the other's fear. The humor in this moment, subtle as it was, came from the mismatch between expectation and response. Supporters expected Kennedy to bristle, to snap back defensively, or to retreat into procedural language. Instead, he treated the confrontation like a ledger entry, something to be examined line by line rather than shouted down. That contrast made the room uneasy because it denied the audience the emotional release they had been primed to enjoy. In politics, denying the crowd its expected payoff can be more disruptive than any insult. As the exchange unfolded, it became clear that this was not just about two politicians, but about two competing definitions of leadership. Is leadership about articulating moral urgency in a way that mobilizes people, even if the details remain fuzzy? Or is leadership about managing constraints, accepting limits, and making decisions that rarely inspire applause but avoid catastrophe? The audience reaction suggested that many people are torn between these impulses, craving inspiration but fearing disappointment. That tension explains why this moment felt bigger than the words being exchanged. If you're wondering why Kennedy's opening line sounded so sharp and why Ocasio-Cortez seemed genuinely unprepared for the direction it took, the reason lies in how each understands power. For her, power is the ability to force issues into the open, to make discomfort unavoidable, and to shame institutions into movement. For him, power is the ability to survive scrutiny, to defend decisions without raising his voice, and to outlast outrage cycles. Those approaches don't just disagree, they operate on different clocks. One thrives on immediacy, the other on endurance. This is why the question whispered in the audience matters so much. Why attack her like that? Why now? The answer isn't personal animosity, and it isn't fear of her popularity. It's that moral authority once claimed invites examination, and examination rarely feels polite. Kennedy wasn't trying to silence her. He was inviting her to stay in the room when the conversation moved from accusation to accounting. Whether she was prepared for that shift would define everything that followed. By the time the chairman attempted to restore order, it was already clear that the hearing had changed shape. What began as a routine session had become a referendum on two political instincts colliding in real time. The audience sensed that something irreversible had started, even if they couldn't yet say who would benefit from it. This wasn't a viral clip yet. It was a slow burn, the kind that only becomes obvious in retrospect. And as the room settled into an uneasy quiet, the real question emerged. Not who was right, but who would be willing to stay. When the easy applause stopped, the shift that followed her opening attack was subtle enough that casual viewers almost missed it. But anyone familiar with congressional dynamics could feel the air tighten as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez realized that the energy she had summoned was no longer fully under her control. She had come in expecting resistance, perhaps even derision, because resistance feeds the narrative of moral courage, and derision can be folded neatly into claims of dismissal by an out-of-touch establishment. What she encountered instead was something far less cinematic and far more dangerous to a movement built on momentum. She encountered stillness, calculation, and a refusal to play the role she had written for her opponent. That refusal altered the geometry of the exchange, forcing her to fill space she had expected someone else to occupy. Ocasio-Cortez leaned harder into the language of urgency, because urgency is the currency of modern political persuasion. She spoke about people dying from preventable causes, about communities crushed by systems designed without them in mind, about an economy that rewards extraction rather than care. Every sentence was structured to leave no moral escape hatch, no place where disagreement could exist without appearing callous. This is not accidental rhetoric. It is disciplined, rehearsed, and honed through years of speaking to audiences that reward clarity over complexity. In rallies and on social media, this style is devastatingly effective because it compresses sprawling policy debates into moral binaries that are easy to share. From her perspective, that compression is not manipulation, it is translation. She believes that technical language has been used for decades to obscure harm, to make injustice feel abstract and therefore tolerable. By stripping away nuance, she forces attention onto outcomes, onto suffering that can no longer be buried under charts or legislative jargon. That instinct explains why she does not soften accusations once they are made. In her framework, to soften is to retreat, and retreat is indistinguishable from betrayal. Yet this approach carries a hidden cost that becomes visible only in environments like this one. When every disagreement is framed as a moral failure, there is no space left for error, trade-offs, or unintended consequences. Anyone who questions feasibility is recast as indifferent to suffering, and anyone who asks for numbers is accused of prioritizing spreadsheets over lives. That framing electrifies supporters, but narrows the coalition required to turn slogans into durable law. It also invites scrutiny of whether the rhetoric aligns with results, a test that movements do not always pass gracefully. John Kennedy recognized this vulnerability and chose not to exploit it immediately, which was itself a strategic decision. By allowing her to continue uninterrupted, he let the audience hear the full cadence of her argument without dilution. There is an old legislative instinct that says the best way to challenge a speech is to let it end. Once the emotional crescendo fades, what remains is structure, and structure is where questions begin. Kennedy understood that interrupting would only validate the confrontation she wanted. When he finally spoke again, his tone was neither dismissive nor defensive. and that neutrality carried its own provocation. He did not deny that suffering exists or mock the idea of systemic failure, because denial would have placed him on moral defense. Instead, he reframed the conversation toward cause and effect, toward what happens after the chant ends and the cameras leave. This reframing was not designed to win applause, and that was precisely why it worked. In a room conditioned to react to heat, the sudden appearance of cold logic felt disorienting. From my vantage point, this was the moment when the clash stopped being about ideology and started being about method. Ocasio-Cortez was arguing from a place of moral acceleration, pushing society to move faster than its existing structures allow. Kennedy was arguing from institutional inertia, warning that speed without stability can produce collapse rather than reform. Both positions claim to protect ordinary people, but they imagine different threats. One fears stagnation and cruelty through inaction. The other fears chaos and unintended harm through overreach. The humor that surfaced during this phase of the exchange was quiet, almost uncomfortable, and it worked precisely because it was understated. Kennedy used plain-spoken phrases that sounded harmless until their implications landed, the kind of remarks that draw a delayed reaction. A few people in the gallery chuckled before realizing they were laughing at a serious point, then quickly stopped, unsure whether humor was appropriate. That hesitation reflected the deeper discomfort of seeing moral certainty that slowed down by questions it could not easily dismiss. Comedy in politics often reveals tension rather than relieving it, and this was a textbook example. Ocasio-Cortez attempted to reclaim momentum by broadening her critique, shifting from specific policies to systemic indictments. She spoke of entrenched interests, revolving doors, and a political class insulated from the consequences of its decisions. These themes resonate because they are grounded in lived frustration, even among those who disagree with her prescriptions. By expanding the frame, she sought to recapture the narrative high ground where details feel secondary to injustice. But expansion can dilute focus, and in this setting, dilution worked against her. Kennedy responded not by challenging the existence of corruption, but by narrowing the lens back to responsibility. He acknowledged that systems can fail while insisting that individuals still make choices within them. This insistence unsettled the binary logic of her argument, because it suggested that critique must be accompanied by accountability. It also hinted at a deeper skepticism toward movements that position themselves as permanently oppositional, even after gaining power. Once you are in office, he implied, protest rhetoric becomes governance rhetoric, whether you like it or not. This exchange illuminated a paradox that defines much of contemporary progressive politics. The language of insurgency remains compelling even when insurgents become insiders. Ocasio-Cortez still speaks as if she is fighting the system from outside, even as she helps shape it from within. That dual identity energizes supporters but exposes her to charges of selective responsibility. Kennedy's approach sought to press on that fault line without explicitly naming it, letting viewers connect the dots themselves. As the back and forth continued, the gallery's energy shifted from applause to attentive silence. People were no longer reacting, they were listening, and listening changes the stakes of any confrontation. When audiences listen, they compare, they weigh, and they notice inconsistencies that chance can obscure. This was not the environment Ocasio-Cortez thrives in, but it was one she could not avoid. She adjusted by emphasizing intention, arguing that imperfect action is better than perfect paralysis. That argument has emotional force, and it is not without merit. Many transformative policies were born from imperfect beginnings, shaped and reshaped through conflict. Kennedy did not dispute that history. but he challenged the assumption that intent alone absolves outcomes. He reminded the room that good intentions have bankrupted cities, collapsed industries, and hollowed out communities when paired with weak execution. This reminder was not framed as accusation, but as caution, which made it harder to dismiss. The most telling moment in this phase came when Ocasio-Cortez accused critics of hiding behind procedure to avoid moral choices. It was a familiar charge, and one that often lands effectively against bureaucratic inertia. Kennedy replied by noting that procedure exists because previous moral crusades had produced disasters when unchecked. The exchange revealed a fundamental disagreement about history itself, whether it is primarily a record of progress delayed or of mistakes repeated. Neither side fully persuaded the other, but persuasion was no longer the primary goal. What was happening instead was exposure. Exposure of assumptions, exposure of blind spots, exposure of the trade-offs each side preferred not to foreground. For Ocasio-Cortez, the exposure lay in how quickly moral language can be tested once it collides with governance realities. For Kennedy, the exposure lay in how easily caution can be mistaken for indifference, if not articulated clearly. Viewers watching closely could see both strengths and weaknesses emerging simultaneously. From a strategic standpoint, this was a dangerous place for Ocasio-Cortez to linger. Her brand depends on clarity, momentum, and the sense that history is on her side. Extended scrutiny threatens that clarity by introducing complexity that resists slogans. Yet retreat would have signaled vulnerability, something she could not afford in front of cameras primed for viral judgment. So she pressed forward, doubling down on values and framing resistance as proof of righteousness. Kennedy, sensing the moment, did not escalate. He allowed the pressure to build organically, trusting that unanswered questions would weigh heavier than direct confrontation. This patience reflected a long-term view of politics as endurance rather than spectacle. He understood that movements often win moments but lose timelines, and he was content to play for the latter. In that sense, the exchange was less a debate than a stress test of political philosophy. As this part of the hearing drew to a close, it was clear that neither side had been neutralized. Ocasio-Cortez still commanded attention, and Kennedy still projected control. But the simplicity that had fueled her initial charge had been complicated, and the calm that defined his response had been sharpened. The audience was left not with a verdict, but with an unease that demanded further examination. And that unease set the stage for what would follow, when rhetoric would give way to specifics, and moral certainty would be asked to account for measurable consequences. What changed the dynamic in this phase of the exchange was not volume or accusation, but the sudden introduction of specificity. Because specificity has a way of stripping ideology down to its load-bearing beams. When John Kennedy pivoted from moral framing to consequences, the room sensed that the conversation was no longer about who cared more, but about who could explain what actually happens next. He did not present himself as the guardian of virtue, and he did not dispute the sincerity of outrage, which would have been the easiest straw man to knock down. Instead, he spoke as if outrage were a raw material that still needed engineering before it could become policy. That distinction, subtle as it sounds, is where many political movements either mature or fracture. Kennedy's questions began to narrow, not to trap, but to focus. And focus is uncomfortable for rhetoric, designed to mobilize rather than to operationalize. He asked what timelines looked like once legislation passed, how costs would be distributed across regions, and which communities would absorb disruption first. These were not rhetorical questions, and they were not framed to elicit applause. They were framed like audit inquiries, the kind that assume good intentions but demand clarity anyway. In a hearing room accustomed to posturing, that tone landed like a foreign language. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez responded by reaffirming values, reiterating that inaction carries costs too, and that delay often means continued suffering for those already on the margins. Her answer was not evasive so much as directional, pulling the conversation back toward urgency and moral stakes. This is a common and effective tactic when policy details risk diluting the emotional core of an argument. Yet each return to values left the questions about implementation hanging in the air, unanswered and increasingly conspicuous. The audience could feel the asymmetry growing, even if it did not immediately know how to name it. From my perspective, this was the point where the debate stopped being about left versus right and became about upstream versus downstream thinking. Upstream thinking focuses on causes, intentions, and moral imperatives, while downstream thinking focuses on effects, trade-offs, and unintended consequences. Ocasio-Cortez was speaking upstream, where clarity feels achievable and righteousness feels justified. Kennedy was dragging the conversation downstream, where clarity blurs and choices become ethically messy. Neither approach is illegitimate, but only one survives contact with governance over time. The humor that surfaced here was almost accidental, a byproduct of contrast rather than a punchline. Kennedy described policy proposals the way one might describe a well-meaning but poorly planned road trip, noting that enthusiasm does not prevent breakdowns if the map is wrong. A few people laughed before catching themselves, unsure whether laughter trivialized the stakes. That hesitation revealed the tension between wanting politics to feel inspiring and needing it to function. In that moment, humor served as a pressure valve, releasing discomfort without resolving it. Ocasio-Cortez attempted to counter by reframing cost concerns as excuses historically used to block progress. She cited past reforms that were once deemed too expensive or unrealistic, only to become pillars of modern society. This is a powerful historical argument, and it resonates because it contains truth. Many policies that now feel inevitable were once controversial precisely because they demanded sacrifice. But Kennedy responded by pointing out that those reforms succeeded not because costs were ignored, but because they were managed. He reminded the committee that Social Security, Medicare, and major infrastructure programs were built through compromise, phased implementation, and constant revision. They were not enacted as maximalist visions frozen in time, but as adaptive systems that evolved with feedback. This distinction mattered because it reframed history not as a series of moral leaps, but as a process of disciplined iteration. By invoking that lineage, Kennedy positioned caution not as obstruction, but as stewardship. It was a reframing that challenged the idea that skepticism is synonymous with cruelty. The gallery's reaction reflected this shift, moving from reactive enthusiasm to measured attention. People were no longer choosing sides based on identity or ideology, but tracking coherence. They listened for answers rather than affirmations, and that subtle change altered the incentives of the exchange. In spaces driven by spectacle, attention is won through intensity, but in spaces driven by deliberation, it is sustained through explanation. Kennedy's approach was built for the latter, even if it looked dull by viral standards. Ocasio-Cortez sensed the change and attempted to accelerate again, raising the stakes by invoking climate deadlines and generational urgency. She argued that incrementalism risks locking in irreversible harm, and that bold action is necessary precisely because time is limited. This argument carries weight, particularly among younger voters who view delay as betrayal. Yet urgency, when unaccompanied by sequencing, can feel like a demand for trust rather than a plan. Kennedy seized on that gap, asking who bears the risk, if timelines prove unrealistic. His questions were not accusatory, but they were persistent, and persistence can be more destabilizing than confrontation. He asked whether workers displaced by rapid transitions would be supported immediately or promised retraining later. He asked how regions dependent on certain industries would be protected from sudden collapse. He asked how success would be measured and what metrics would trigger course correction. Each question underscored the same point, that good intentions do not exempt policies from failure modes. From where I sit, this is where the audience began to see the difference between moral confidence and operational confidence. Moral confidence declares what must be done, while operational confidence explains how failure will be prevented. Ocasio-Cortez projected the former with conviction, but the latter remained largely implicit. Kennedy projected the latter by default, even at the cost of appearing uninspiring. In governance, inspiration often initiates change, but operations determine whether change endures. The exchange grew quieter, not because tension dissipated, but because both sides realized that escalation would not resolve the underlying mismatch. Ocasio-Cortez could not abandon urgency without undermining her core message. Kennedy could not abandon scrutiny without betraying his premise that responsibility matters more than performance. This stalemate revealed a deeper truth about modern politics, that many conflicts persist because they operate on different evaluative criteria. One side measures success by alignment with values, the other by survivability of outcomes. At one point, Ocasio-Cortez suggested that excessive focus on costs reflects a political culture that prioritizes comfort over justice. Kennedy replied that ignoring costs often shifts pain onto those least equipped to absorb it. That response landed heavily, because it reframed cost not as a barrier, but as a moral variable itself. If costs are real, then pretending otherwise does not eliminate them. It merely redistributes them invisibly. This reframing challenged the assumption that moral clarity alone guarantees moral outcomes. The audience could sense that this was no longer a battle for dominance, but an exposition of incompatible instincts. Ocasio-Cortez's supporters valued her refusal to compromise on principle, seeing it as evidence of authenticity. Kennedy's supporters valued his insistence on process, seeing it as evidence of seriousness. Neither camp was persuaded to defect, but both were forced to confront the limits of their preferred style. That confrontation is uncomfortable, and discomfort is often the prelude to either growth or retreat. As this phase of the hearing concluded, the mood was not triumphant, but unsettled. There had been no knockout line, no viral humiliation, and no clear winner. Instead, there was a lingering awareness that slogans and spreadsheets speak different languages, and that translation between them is rarely seamless. The audience understood that the next stage would demand more than posture. It would demand evidence. And it was clear that when specifics replaced symbolism, the stakes would rise, not fall. By the time this phase of the hearing unfolded, it was no longer possible to pretend that the disagreement was merely about policy preference or partisan posture, because what had emerged was a philosophical divide about how power should be exercised once rhetoric collides with reality. The room felt different now, less like a venue for persuasion, and more like a laboratory where competing theories of governance were being stress-tested in public. What made this moment compelling was not hostility, but the growing recognition that both sides were arguing past each other while insisting they were speaking plainly. This was not confusion, it was collision, and collisions reveal structure in ways smooth motion never does. At this point, the hearing stopped rewarding confidence and began rewarding coherence. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez leaned into what she knows best, reframing the debate as a struggle between moral courage and institutional complacency. She argued that history rarely forgives those who waited for perfect conditions before acting, and that excessive caution often disguises fear of upsetting entrenched interests. Her words carried the cadence of moral urgency, the kind that treats delay as an ethical failure rather than a logistical concern. In her framing, systems do not drift accidentally. They drift because people in power choose comfort over confrontation. That framing resonated with listeners who see institutions as fundamentally resistant to change unless forced. She spoke of movements rather than mechanisms, of justice rather than implementation, because movements create pressure that mechanisms alone cannot. From her perspective, governance without pressure calcifies, and compromise without leverage becomes surrender. She suggested that incrementalism has been romanticized by those insulated from its costs, people who can afford patience because they are not the ones paying the price of delay. This argument is emotionally potent because it appeals to lived experience rather than abstract modeling. It positions urgency not as recklessness, but as empathy translated into action. John Kennedy responded not by rejecting that empathy, but by questioning its direction once it enters the machinery of the state. He acknowledged that institutions resist change, but warned that resistance is not the only danger governments face. He spoke about fragility, about how systems built too quickly or without redundancy can collapse under pressure, harming the very people they were meant to protect. This was not an argument against ambition, but against impatience masquerading as virtue. Kennedy framed governance as an exercise in constraint, where ignoring limits does not eliminate them. It only hides them until they fail catastrophically. The philosophical core of this exchange rested on a single question neither side stated explicitly, but both were circling relentlessly. Is moral legitimacy derived from intention or from outcome? Ocasio-Cortez argued, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that intention matters most when systems have proven unjust, because demanding perfect outcomes before acting perpetuates harm. Kennedy countered that outcomes ultimately define legitimacy, because intentions do not repair damage once policies misfire. This tension is ancient, and it surfaces every time reform movements collide with governing institutions. What made this confrontation feel contemporary, rather than theoretical, was the way each side invoked history differently. Ocasio-Cortez cited past injustices prolonged by caution, moments when societies knew change was needed, but delayed until damage was irreversible. She treated history as a moral indictment, a ledger of failures caused by hesitation. Kennedy treated history as a technical archive, a record of what happens when systems are pushed beyond their capacity. To him, history was not a warning against caution, but against neglecting second-order effects. As the exchange deepened, the audience could sense that this was not a debate designed to convert opponents, but to clarify loyalties. Supporters of Ocasio-Cortez nodded along as she spoke of solidarity, collective responsibility, and the moral bankruptcy of half measures. Supporters of Kennedy leaned back, arms crossed, as he spoke of sustainability, unintended consequences, and the moral weight of failure. Both groups believed they were defending vulnerable populations, yet they disagreed fundamentally on how vulnerability is created and mitigated. This mirrored a broader cultural divide that extends far beyond any single hearing. The discomfort in the room intensified when Kennedy raised the issue of permanence. He asked whether movements that thrive on urgency are equipped to govern once urgency fades, or whether they require perpetual crisis to sustain momentum. This question struck at the heart of activist politics, suggesting that outrage can be both fuel and trap. If a movement depends on emergency to justify action, What happens when normalcy returns, even imperfect normalcy? Ocasio-Cortez rejected the premise, arguing that normalcy itself has been unjust for too many people to accept as baseline. Her rebuttal reframed crisis as continuity, asserting that what some call stability, others experience as chronic harm. In that light, perpetual urgency is not manufactured. It is inherited. This was one of her strongest moments, because it challenged the assumption that calm equals fairness. It reminded listeners that equilibrium can coexist with inequality, and that peace is not evenly distributed. Kennedy did not dispute this reality, but he questioned whether governing as if in permanent crisis erodes the capacity to plan long-term. He spoke about institutional memory, about how policies outlast movements, and how decisions made under pressure can lock in consequences for generations. This was not a plea for inaction, but for sequencing, for aligning ambition with durability. Kennedy argued that systems need time to absorb change without breaking, especially when lives and livelihoods are intertwined with those systems. In his view, recklessness is not defined by passion, but by indifference to failure modes. That framing shifted the moral burden, suggesting that responsibility includes anticipating what goes wrong, not just what goes right. The exchange reached a kind of philosophical stalemate, where both sides articulated internally consistent but externally incompatible visions. Ocasio-Cortez envisioned governance as an extension of moral struggle, where clarity of purpose justifies speed and confrontation. Kennedy envisioned governance as custodianship, where restraint is itself an ethical stance. Neither vision could fully absorb the other without losing coherence. This was not a failure of argument, but a revelation of difference. For observers, this was the moment when the hearing transcended its immediate context and became emblematic of a broader dilemma. How does a society balance the demand for justice with the need for stability? How does it act decisively without becoming brittle? How does it honor urgency without surrendering foresight? These questions do not yield to slogans, and that was precisely why the room felt heavy with implication. As the chairman signaled that time was running short, neither side appeared satisfied. There had been no concession, no dramatic reversal, and no emotional collapse. Instead, there was clarity, the unsettling kind that reveals limits rather than victories. Viewers watching closely could see that this confrontation had not resolved anything, but it had sharpened the lines of disagreement. And that sharpening set the stage for the next phase, where abstract philosophy would be forced to confront concrete consequences, and where the cost of each vision would be measured not in words, but in real-world trade-offs. The room no longer felt like a hearing room. It felt like a courtroom without a judge. A place where reputations were weighed, not by volume or outrage, but by accumulation, by pattern, by the quiet weight of evidence stacked so high that denial itself began to look childish. John Kennedy understood this moment better than anyone in the room, because he had spent decades watching politicians mistake noise for strength, believing that moral certainty could replace accountability, and assuming that a compelling narrative could survive direct contact with facts. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was no longer performing for the cameras now. The performance had collapsed under its own contradictions, and what remained was something far more dangerous in politics than anger. It was exposure. Not the kind that comes from opposition research or leaked emails, but the kind that comes when your own words, your own choices, your own public record begin to argue against you more effectively than any opponent ever could. Kennedy leaned back slightly, not as a gesture of retreat, but as a signal that the chase was over. Because in American politics, the most devastating moments rarely arrive with shouting. They arrive when there is nothing left to interrupt. He spoke again, slower now, not to wound but to define, not to accuse but to frame. Because framing, he knew, is how history decides who was serious and who was merely loud. He reminded the room that politics is not theater by accident. It becomes theater when leaders stop believing they owe anyone results, when they discover that outrage travels faster than outcomes, and that identity, when wielded carelessly, can become a shield against responsibility rather than a reason to carry it more carefully. He did not need to say her name every sentence because everyone understood who he was talking about, and that understanding carried more weight than repetition ever could. What followed was not a list of scandals, but a meditation on power, on the temptation faced by young politicians who rise quickly in a media ecosystem that rewards symbolism over substance. Kennedy described how viral politics creates a feedback loop, how applause becomes addictive, how applause teaches you to speak only to those who already agree with you, and how that isolation eventually turns confidence into arrogance and certainty into blindness. He asked a question that landed harder than any accusation. What happens when a politician begins to confuse attention with achievement, and how many people get hurt in the gap between the two? The silence that followed was not hostile. It was reflective, because many in the room understood that the question extended beyond one congresswoman, beyond one hearing, beyond one viral confrontation. Kennedy spoke about working families again, not as abstractions but as obligations, and he returned to the idea that policy failures do not disappear just because they are wrapped in good intentions. He reminded everyone that losing a job is not an ideological experience, it is a practical one. That rent does not accept slogans as payment. That groceries do not become cheaper because a politician feels morally correct about a decision made on social media. There was a quiet, almost uncomfortable moment when he acknowledged that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had talent, intelligence, and opportunity, that she could have been a bridge between generations, between ideals and implementation, between anger and solutions. That admission made the critique sharper, not softer, because wasted potential is always more tragic than simple incompetence. He questioned whether moral absolutism had replaced moral responsibility in modern political activism, whether the refusal to compromise had become a badge of honor rather than a failure of governance, and whether the loudest voices in the room had forgotten that democracy is not designed to reward purity, but to produce outcomes that allow imperfect people to live better lives. Somewhere in the gallery, a reporter realized this was no longer about who had won the exchange, because the exchange itself had become secondary to the larger indictment of performative politics. This was not a takedown, it was an autopsy, and the cause of death was not opposition, but internal contradiction. Kennedy addressed the accusation that criticism itself is violence, that accountability is oppression, that disagreement is hostility, and he dismantled it calmly, almost gently, by pointing out that if scrutiny only applies to those without power, then power ceases to be public service and becomes entitlement. He reminded the room that representation is not immunity, and that identity, while meaningful, does not erase the obligation to answer for one's actions. He did not deny systemic inequality, he contextualized it, explaining that structural injustice cannot be solved by symbolic gestures alone, and that real progress requires the unglamorous work of negotiation, budgeting, prioritization, and sometimes choosing the least bad option instead of the most rhetorically satisfying one. That kind of honesty, he suggested, is less exciting on television, but far more valuable in the lives of actual people. At one point, he paused, looked directly at the gallery, and asked whether anyone believed that the families who lost job opportunities cared about ideological victories. or whether the hairstylist who waited months to be paid found comfort in political branding. The question was not rhetorical, it was uncomfortable, and discomfort, Kennedy knew, is where learning begins. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez attempted to reassert control, to return to familiar language about systems and power structures, but the words landed differently now, because once credibility fractures, even true statements lose force. This was not cruelty, it was consequence, and the difference matters in politics, even if it is often ignored. Kennedy did not press further because he did not need to. The room had already shifted, not emotionally but intellectually, and that shift would ripple outward long after the cameras stopped recording. The most damaging political moments are rarely the ones that dominate headlines. They are the ones that quietly reframe how people interpret everything that comes next. As the hearing moved toward its inevitable break, Kennedy offered no victory speech, no triumphant conclusion, only a reminder that public service is not a performance contract, but a trust. And that trust, once broken, is extraordinarily difficult to repair. He suggested that the real test of leadership is not how well one attacks opponents, but how one responds when confronted with one's own record. Outside the chamber, the narrative was already being rewritten in real time, not by spin doctors, but by ordinary viewers who had watched something unexpected unfold. Not a shouting match, not a viral clip, but a sustained confrontation between image and evidence. And many of them were asking a question that would not go away easily. A question that does not fit neatly into partisan frames. If the words sound right, but the outcomes look wrong, which should we believe? That question, more than any insult or accusation, lingered in the air as the session recessed, because it did not belong to John Kennedy, and it did not belong to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It belonged to the audience, to voters, to citizens who are increasingly suspicious of politics that feels emotionally satisfying, but materially empty. And somewhere beneath the noise of commentary, beneath the trending hashtags and reaction clips, a quieter reckoning was beginning, one that would not resolve itself in a single news cycle, one that would follow speeches, votes, and decisions going forward, asking again and again whether this was leadership, or whether it was something easier, something louder, something that demanded applause, but delivered very little in return. The hearing room emptied, but the argument did not end there, because the most consequential debates in American politics rarely conclude on camera. They continue in kitchens, in break rooms, in rides home from work, in the minds of people who do not care who won, only whether anyone in power actually understands the cost of being wrong. By the time the hearing finally dissolved into procedural formalities and polite closing remarks, something far more consequential than a viral confrontation had already taken place. Because what unfolded was not merely a clash between two political personalities, but a collision between two fundamentally different understandings of what power is supposed to be used for in a democratic society. John Kennedy did not leave the room as a victor in the traditional sense, because victory implies an opponent defeated. And what had happened was more unsettling than that. It was the slow exposure of a worldview that had grown accustomed to applause without consequence, moral certainty without verification, and symbolism without accountability. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did not walk out as a villain either, despite how quickly some corners of the media would try to simplify the moment, because villains imply malice, and what was on display felt closer to something else entirely, a kind of ideological intoxication that had gone unchecked for too long. The most uncomfortable truth for viewers was not that one side had better arguments, but that one side appeared more interested in outcomes, while the other seemed increasingly committed to narrative dominance. And that distinction matters far more in real life than it does on social media. Politics, when reduced to performance, can feel emotionally satisfying while quietly hollowing out the trust that makes institutions function. And trust, once eroded, does not return simply because the rhetoric improves. Kennedy's closing posture was telling not because of what he said, but because of what he refused to do. He did not mock, he did not grandstand, and he did not attempt to deliver a viral one-liner to seal the moment. Instead, he leaned into something far less fashionable in modern politics: restraint. And restraint, paradoxically, often carries more authority than outrage ever could. He reminded the audience implicitly that accountability is not an attack, and that discomfort is not oppression, and that being challenged on one's record is not an act of cruelty, but a basic requirement of public service. These ideas, once considered foundational to democratic governance, now feel almost radical in a media environment that rewards indignation and punishes introspection. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for her part, became a case study not in hypocrisy alone, but in how quickly a political figure can begin to believe their own mythology. When every critique is framed as bad faith, when every question is dismissed as an attack, and when every contradiction is explained away as context, the space for self-correction collapses, and without self-correction, power becomes brittle. The hearing forced an unavoidable confrontation with that brittleness, because facts do not care how well-intentioned someone believes themselves to be, and consequences do not wait for the right narrative framing. The families who lost job opportunities did not experience their losses as ideological debates, and the small business owners who planned for growth did not measure their bankruptcies in moral abstractions. One of the most revealing aspects of the moment was how quickly the language of activism attempted to substitute for the language of responsibility. Words like system, structure, and injustice were invoked not to explain outcomes, but to deflect from them. And while those concepts are real and meaningful, they lose credibility when used as shields against legitimate scrutiny. Kennedy never denied that the system is flawed, but he insisted that acknowledging flaws does not absolve leaders from answering for their own decisions. That insistence struck a nerve precisely because it undermined the growing assumption that moral alignment automatically confers moral exemption. For many viewers, especially those outside the political class, the exchange crystallized a growing unease with a style of leadership that feels more invested in visibility than viability. They recognized something familiar in the pattern: promises framed as absolutes, victories measured in headlines, and setbacks blamed on enemies rather than miscalculations. The irony, difficult to ignore, was that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had built her brand on claiming to speak for the voiceless. Yet the most compelling voices in the room were those who did not speak in slogans at all. They spoke in lost wages, closed storefronts, delayed payments, and abandoned plans. And those stories cut through ideology in a way no talking point ever could. Kennedy's critique landed not because it was harsh, but because it was cumulative. And cumulative truth is far more dangerous than a single scandal. One mistake can be forgiven, one contradiction can be explained, but a pattern forces a reckoning, and reckoning is what modern politics works hardest to avoid. As the media cycle spun up in the hours that followed, commentators predictably tried to reduce the moment to a winner and a loser, but that framing missed the deeper implication entirely. The real question was not who dominated the exchange, but whether the audience was beginning to reevaluate what they reward in their leaders. Do voters want politicians who sound right, or politicians who get things right, even when the results are messy, incomplete, and unsatisfying on camera? Do they want moral theater, or moral responsibility? Do they want representatives who fight constantly, or representatives who build quietly and imperfectly? These questions are deeply uncomfortable because they do not map neatly onto party lines, and discomfort is politically inconvenient. It is much easier to rally people around identity, outrage, and certainty than it is to ask them to wrestle with trade-offs, constraints, and unintended consequences. The hearing exposed how fragile performative politics becomes when stripped of its echo chamber. In a controlled environment, slogans dominate, but in a setting where decisions are interrogated and impacts measured, slogans collapse under their own weight. Kennedy's final act was not to press his advantage, but to withdraw from the spotlight, a move that itself sent a message. He understood that the goal was not humiliation, but illumination, and that once the light is on, it does not need to be held indefinitely. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez left the chamber facing something far more challenging than opposition: introspection. Whether she would engage with it remained an open question, and one that would define the next phase of her political career far more than any viral clip ever could. Because the harshest judgment in politics is not defeat, it is irrelevance. And irrelevance does not arrive when people disagree with you. It arrives when they stop believing that your words correspond to reality. In the days that followed, conversations sparked in places far removed from Washington, in kitchens, workplaces, and long commutes home, where people asked themselves whether passion alone is enough, whether good intentions excuse bad outcomes, and whether leaders should be judged by what they promise or by what actually happens to the people they claim to serve. That conversation is far more dangerous to the political status quo than any single hearing, because it shifts the metric of legitimacy away from performance and back toward responsibility. And once voters begin to recalibrate that metric, the consequences ripple outward in ways no communication strategy can fully contain. What made the moment resonate was not its drama, but its familiarity. Many people have seen versions of this dynamic in their own lives. Leaders who talk eloquently but fail to deliver. Managers who champion values while neglecting those under their authority. Institutions that reward visibility over competence. The hearing simply concentrated that dynamic into a single frame, making it harder to ignore and impossible to unsee. And perhaps the most unsettling realization for the audience was this: if a politician cannot withstand scrutiny from someone armed only with publicly available facts and basic questions, what does that say about the resilience of their platform and about the standards we have allowed to slip in the process of choosing our representatives? The exchange did not answer that question. It posed it, and questions, especially unresolved ones, are the most powerful forces in democratic life. Because once a voter begins to ask whether their leaders are accountable to outcomes or merely to applause, the relationship between power and performance begins to change. And the final question lingers long after the cameras shut off, long after the hearing room empties, long after the headlines fade. A question that cannot be dodged by rhetoric or reframed by spin. A question that ultimately belongs not to politicians, but to the public itself. If leadership demands responsibility and responsibility demands results, how long are we willing to reward those who offer only conviction, while the consequences of being wrong are quietly paid by everyone else?